Welcome back to the parillaworks channel, and in this video I'll be showing you how I made this chessboard. The three species of wood I'll be using are Cocobolo and curly maple, which will be the squares, and then the frame will be made of an East Indian rosewood. A lot of the online retailers that sell exotic and figured woods will list these boards individually with a variety of pictures so that you can see what each board has to offer. So the client and myself were able to specifically choose these boards and go for the look we were after. Now I got started as usual at the joiner, getting some clean edges and faces on the boards, took them over to the table saw, and then I'll kind of go back and forth between the drum sander and joiner here. After preparing 4 strips of each species, I bundled them up with some clamps and ran them through the drum sander. Now this setting right here is the exact dimension of the squares I need for the chessboard, and that is going to be 2 1/8 inch. So I'll keep this setting on the drum sander and not change it until I come back later when the strips are ripped into their squares. That way I can sand the end grain sides of these later on. I took some time to arrange the strips in a nice way and then used the clamps to kind of keep everything stable. And then I applied some blue tape to each joint, which will be the real clamp for this glue up. I could then add glue to each joint. The blue tape you can see here holds everything together, so I could add glue, close the joint, and move on to the next one. There's no need to really spread the glue out with a brush or anything. As you close this joint, the glue spreads out nicely and you get a nice bit of squeeze out, so you know that that joint is full of glue. I ended up adding a few clamps here just to kind of make sure that the piece did not bow in one direction or the other. Now this was a while ago now, so I can't exactly remember how I cleaned up the glue squeeze out in this situation, but in any event, the board looks relatively clean here before taking it to the table saw to cross-cut the 8 strips needed for the chessboard. I ended up getting 9 strips, so having one extra was pretty good just in case I messed something up. But you can see that I got these boards cut nicely with the table saw fence. I cut these slightly oversized, maybe like a 1/16 of an inch or so, before taking them back to the drum sander using the same bundled clamp method. And because I kept the drum sander set at the same setting as the previous operation, I know that these pieces will all be perfectly square. Now this glue up was pretty similar to the last one, except I used these strips between the clamps to align the outside edges of the board. And what this did was, like I said, align the outside edges, but it also aligned all of the corners of each square. And that's one of the big things with the chessboard, is you want all those squares to be perfectly aligned. Then I can add my tape and then add the glue again. And this is an end grain to end grain joint, which is not very strong, but it will be strong enough until I can get this whole thing glued down to the MDF substrate. I ran the piece through the drum sander a few times just to kind of smooth out both sides, as well as take down some thickness so that this thing wouldn't move too much once it's glued down to the MDF. I also cleaned up any of the edges with some sandpaper, and that's on a hard backer just so I don't round any of those edges over. And then finally I can add glue to the surface and glue it down to the MDF. I was just using a piece of 1/2 inch MDF, and then I sandwiched that between some other pieces of MDF just to apply the clamping pressure evenly. I ran the piece through the drum sander a few more times, and then I took it over to my little rider table to flush up the edges. Now, I didn't mention this before, but the MDF substrate is larger than the veneer by about a 1/16 of an inch on each side. That way I can reference the bearing off the veneer and flush up all the edges. Off camera, I prepared this ambrosia maple or wormy maple veneer for the bottom side. And the reason I chose this wood is because I just had it on hand, but it will be covered with a red felt afterwards, so it doesn't really matter what this species is. I did much of the same process of running it through the drum sander and then flushing up the edges before moving on to the next part of this project. And the next part of this project is the frame. So what you're looking at here is an East Indian rosewood turning blank. And this is about 3 inches by 3 inches and maybe 24 inches long or so. And it was a type of piece I had to get for the dimensions we needed for the frame. Now usually I wouldn't want to buy a piece this thick because it's pretty expensive to get, but it was the best option we had, and it ended up having some nice grain in it. Now, nobody really cares about sanding, but I had to make sure that I didn't round any of these edges over, so I made sure to go pretty slow, especially when I got to the outside edges of the board. As well as with these frame pieces, I clamped them all together so that I wouldn't round those edges over, especially because they're only an inch thick, so when I have them all together, it's a 4-inch thick piece and it's much easier to sand. I adjusted my miter gauge to 45 degrees and made the necessary cuts on all 4 pieces. I have the stop block set to the exact length I needed, which is something I figured out using trial and error with a bunch of test pieces off camera. To allow the frame pieces to sit flush with the bottom of the chessboard, I routed these grooves in the sides of the boards as well as the sides of the frame pieces. I'll then use a plywood spline to glue the pieces together. And here you can see how that spline and groove setup works. Well, fast forward 4 months, and here we are after building 2 large apothecary cabinets. I pulled this thing off the top of my CNC where it had been sitting for a while and got to finishing it up. Now, since I took so much time off with it, I wasn't sure how much these miters had moved, so I started by gluing up 2 of them at first, and then after those dried, I glued the second 2 in place. And I had to make an adjustment on one of them just to get a good fit, but it ended up looking pretty nice. I want to give a shout out to RZ Mask for sending me one of their masks. You can see my old mask in the background and it's a bit bulky. This one is much more comfortable and low profile. It prevented me from breathing in the harsh dust from these exotic woods, which did irritate my eyelids a bit. At least it wasn't my lungs. Anyway, the mask was also super helpful when spraying the lacquer finish, as the filters do help block fumes and odors. To save 10%, use code parillaworks on your next order. Thanks, RZ Mask. To reinforce the miters, I added some splines or keys to each corner, and I used this spline jig that I've had for a while. It just rides over the top of the table saw fence. It's pretty common, and there's probably plenty of videos out there showing you how to make one. I glued in some maple for the keys, and this is just the same curly maple that I used earlier in the project, and it gets a nice contrast with the rosewood there. I then added an 1/8 inch round over to the outside edges of the frame before finishing up with some hand sanding. Now my client wanted a semi-gloss finish, so I decided to go with some spray lacquer here, which is something I don't use very often, if at all, but it felt like the right decision here. I wanted to spray the finish, but I also didn't want to buy regular lacquer for my spray gun, so this Deft spray lacquer is pretty high quality, at least from what I've seen. I gave it about 6 to 8 coats, and this stuff dries pretty quick, so I was able to do this in about a day or two. Shield your eyes! Alright, this is a piece of felt with adhesive already on the back, so you just gotta peel the back off and apply your workpiece. This stuff was so sticky. I actually had a failed attempt ahead of this, and I had to peel it off and spend a good amount of time getting the adhesive off. It was kind of like taking the little sticky boogers off a credit card, but 10 times stickier. Anyways, I cut it back with a utility knife, and that was it. I mentioned this on Instagram, at parillaworks for those not following. The lathe was the first tool I bought for myself. At the time I was living in a one-bedroom apartment. I just thought it would be a good fit for someone that didn't have a lot of space. So I ended up starting off with some pens and bowls and things like that, and then I was like, let me make a chess set. So I bought some of this Honduran rosewood and some hard maple, and I got started turning on the pawns, and as you can see, all of these pawns look different, and after I got like 8 of them done, I was like, I can't do this. None of these pieces look the same. Let me move on to something different. So I started making bandsaw boxes where nothing has to look the same. So that's the story of how I got started woodworking. Anyways, that's it for this one. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.